I wanted to make a short video to show you how I scan film, and there are lots of different options available to us when it comes to scanning film. You can either send it off to a lab, which gets you great results, but it can often be very expensive and it takes a lot of time to get your scans back. So if you're shooting a project and you want something back very quickly, or you don't necessarily have the budget to send it to a lab, then hopefully this video will help you. I've already loaded up some film into the negative holders, and I'm just going to make sure that there's as little dust as possible on there so we don't have to remove it all later. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Now, we just need to make sure that the scanner's clear as well. But I did this before shooting the video, so I know it's quite clean. And sometimes when you're shooting a video and your scanner is sideways, it can be very difficult to line up the negative holder in the scanner. Okay, all good. Right, onto the computer. Okay, so I have opened Epson Scan on the computer. I am scanning with an Epson V700. So I've opened up Epson Scan and we need to scan the film. And the key to this whole method is to scan it with as few adjustments as possible in the highest possible quality. So you're effectively going to be creating a raw film scan, and that's not to be confused with a file that can be opened up in Adobe Camera Raw, for example, but it means that it's a file that has all the values from the brightest highlight to the darkest shadow captured. So we need to set our scanner to do that. So we're going to do film with film holder, and we're going to scan it as a positive film. Even if it's a color negative, which is what we're scanning it as a positive film. We are going to make sure that the image type is 48-bit color, because that is the highest quality that you can get. And when it comes to adjusting the colors, you need the 48 bits total, which is 16 bits in each of the red, green and blue channels. We're going to scan it at 2400 DPI, which is kind of the maximum DPI that you can actually get from the Epson V700, and it allows you to print really big. So we're going to make sure that all these are off, so you don't want any unsharp mask or grain reduction or anything like that. And it's very important as well to go into the configuration to set these settings. Now when we go to color, we want to make sure that no color correction is ticked, because we don't want Epson Scan to be doing anything to our color. We want a completely flat scan. So now that's all set up, we can preview the scan. Okay, so now our preview scan has been done, and you can see the individual frames here, but we don't actually want to use a thumbnail view. We want to click normal, and then you can see the film in the film holders. And I'm not going to scan every photo from this roll, but I just want to use a few examples. So what I'm going to do is select the first photo, and you'll see that I've actually included some of the film on the side where nothing's been shot, and this will become very important later on. I'm also going to select that one and that one, and make sure to select all and then scan. So these next options are very important. So we're going to select where we're going to save them. I'm just going to save it in a folder called scans. Now we just need to give the files a name, and I've called this HK0465, which basically means I shot them in Hong Kong, and 0465 is the number of the film from the lab. We need to make sure that we're saving a TIFF, which is really important because that's the highest quality we can get. If you save this as a JPEG, it's not going to work. So just when we go to options, these are the settings I've got. I don't think I've ever changed these. And then once we're happy with that, we just click OK, and the scanner will then scan the negatives. Okay, so now the scanner has finished scanning, and you can see the 3 files we've got here. And let's do a quick preview so you can see what they look like. And as you can see, it looks exactly like a film negative. So first, let's bring this into Photoshop. And we're just going to rotate it. I shot this picture on Kodak Portra 160, which is a really nice fine grain film, and it's got a certain look to it. Now we want to be able to get the best out of this scan possible, so I'm going to show you a few steps on how to firstly invert the film and then color balance it. So we're going to do this all with adjustment layers. That's all that we need to do. We're not using any plugins, we're not using any separate bit of software, it's just in Photoshop using adjustment layers. So the first one that we're going to add is levels. And we're going to actually invert the image using levels. So we're going to use the output levels. So we're going to take the blacks and take them all over to the whites, and then the whites all over to the blacks. So we're just going to switch these round and make sure they're to the end, so the output levels, and make sure they're all the way to the end. And now you can see that we have an inverted image, but it's really washed out, it looks a bit green, and you wouldn't want this as your final image. Now it's looking a bit bright, so what we're going to do is set the midtones level to 1.5. And for Portra 160 and also Portra 400, I found this is a very good starting point. So yeah, I always set it as 1.5. There's no real science behind it, but there's been lots of trial and error, and I find 1.5 has worked really well for me. The next layer we're going to add is another levels layer. And actually, let's call the first one invert, and let's call the second one white balance. So we're going to take the grey point dropper, and we're just going to select what a grey point in the image would be. So that looks quite good to me. Now you can still see that it is looking very washed out. So you can see here, there's a lot of data that we haven't got. So we're just going to use this slider to take out some of the blacks. And if you press Alt and drag it all the way over, you can start to see when the shadows creep in. So what we want to do is just to make sure that we're just on the edge and we don't see any. So it's just a white image. And as you can see there, it's already looking very good. So we're now going to add another layer, which is the curves layer. And we're just going to make a standard S curve with this, just to get the contrast there a bit. Now I'm actually going to rename this layer white balance / exposure, because what we can do with the grey point slider here is actually move it around and adjust our exposure, and all the while keeping the highlights and shadows within a range where they're not clipping. So that looks pretty good to me. Now it's starting to get there, but we need to do a bit more with the color. So I'm going to add a color balance layer, and I can see that in the shadows there is a lot of red, and I can see that because I've been doing this for a long time, and this is very much a case of trial and error to see what looks good. So if we take out some of the red, you can see that it's already starting to look a bit better. So I'm actually going to go a little bit further than I should and just put some reds back into the midtones. I'm just going to take some green out of the midtones and maybe add some yellow, but that goes a bit too green. Maybe take out some green again. That looks pretty good to me. Okay, now I'm actually going to select everything and then copy merged and then paste that. Because when you're working with adjustment layers, I don't know if you can see on YouTube, but around here you can see that it looks a little bit posterized, and this is because we are using adjustment layers, and we haven't changed the original scan at all. It's still a negative, but we've just added these layers. So what I like to do sometimes if it looks a bit too posterized, is just merge all the layers and paste it. So it just gets rid of that. Okay, I'm going to add another curves layer because I want the highlights to pop a little bit more. I think the overall exposure is good, but we need a little more in the highlights. So I'm just going to bring it up a bit and maybe down a tiny bit just to add a bit more contrast. Okay, that to me is looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is just select the bit of the image that I want, and then I can crop it. And that to me looks like a pretty good scan. Okay, we're going to open up the second scan that we've done, and this is of an umbrella. So let's drag it down to Photoshop. So much like before, we're going to add a levels layer, which we're going to use to invert. So let's drag these over, let's swap these over, and I'm going to set this midtones to 1.5. And as you can see, it's looking very blue, very washed out. So we're going to add another levels layer. And with this, we're going to do the white balance. So we've got to find something reasonably grey. And I think maybe, what about that wall there? So let's use this bit of the wall. There's a little bit at the top that looks a bit grey. And also, I've got this set to 31 by 31, and this means that it's going to take an average of 31 pixels in all directions. So if you just do it with a point sample, you could get a little bit of grain or a little bit of dust, and it's not going to be as accurate. So if you set it to 31 by 31, it's going to average that point and give you a pretty accurate white balance. So the next step is to get rid of some of the washed out look in the shadows. So we're going to drag that over here. So we're going to drag this slider to the right. And if we just hold down Alt, we can see where we can stop. So that looks pretty good to me. Okay, and if we let me rename these first. So we're going to use that as invert. And this is white balance and exposure. And the next layer that we've got is just a curves layer. So this gives us the contrast. Okay, so that looks pretty good to me. So it looks a bit dark. So if we take the midtone slider of the white balance and exposure levels layer, we can just have it about there, and that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to put a bit more in the highlights in there, in this curves layer. That looks good to me. And the colour actually doesn't look too bad for this one. That white balance point that I selected is actually pretty good, but I'm just going to add a colour balance layer to see if I can improve it in any way. So we're going to go to shadows, and I'm just going to take out a bit of the red, maybe add in some red highlights. And it's just a case of playing around and seeing what looks good. And this is all down to personal preference. And the more you play about with this, the better you'll get at it. So that looks pretty good to me. So I'm just going to add a curves layer and just push the highlights a little bit, because I think it could do with a bit more contrast. Okay. That looks great to me. So if we make a selection on the image, we can then crop it. And that looks good to me. So I'm seeing a bit of posterization happening up here. And that's because we're working on adjustment layers. So I'm just going to select everything, go to copy merged and paste. And you can see up here that it has now gone. So if I switch that on and off, you'll hopefully be able to see a difference. So that looks like a really nice image to me. And this is basically how I color balance film. Now this method works for pretty much all negative films, and it's a really great way to be able to have complete control over your image, and you don't have to rely on a lab to get your pictures looking exactly the way you want them. It does take a bit of practice to get used to it, but it's just a case of trial and error, and the more scans that you adjust like this, the better you will get. I hope this has helped you, and if you have any questions, then just write them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them.